And we're recording. Take it away.
All right, perfect. Well, thanks for teeing everything up here, Devin. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your day here on, I think, the calm before the storm, literally in this case, out east here as we get ready for quite the winter blast coming in. So, welcome to the Outlook 2026 and 2025 year in review. I am Dave Cherniak, the policy manager of business and transportation here at CIAC. And in that role, I do a lot of like business statistics collection and kind of industry analysis for the industrial chemistry sector, and I'm learning a lot more about the plastic product manufacturing sector as well. So as you kind of see in the title, we're going to do two things here today. We're going to have a chat about what has already happened and about what's coming. And as I've titled it, I think as we go through this, you're going to hear a lot of one word, and that word is uncertainty. And that's been a really key theme for the last year in chemistry and plastics, and will continue being one here in 2026. So there are three things I'd like to accomplish today. I'd like to provide a quick economic review of 2025, what our predictions were at the start of last year, and kind of how things transpired. We're then going to take an outlook. Going to take a discussion here into the outlook for 2026, and take a gander at the forces impacting the chemistry and plastic sectors. And then, kind of interspersed throughout this, we're going to discuss critical policy areas for chemistry and plastics in 2026, the types of things that we're watching here at CIC and we're advocating for our members on in that case. So, Canadian chemistry and plastics in 2025. In Outlook 2025, which was published in the late fall of 2024, I had forecasted kind of growth in 1 to 4% growth in shipments with relatively stable output and a moderate increase in prices. Now, that was made in 2020, that was made in kind of November, December timeframe. We did have the results of the US election, so uncertainty was building in that, but I don't really think anybody could have predicted fully what was about to come through. The actual results for 2025 were much softer than anticipated. Shipments and exports in particular declined significantly, 8% in the case of shipments, and exports by about 12%. In that, though, I did get one part of the forecast right. Chemical and resin volumes on the whole, when put together, were relatively stable. We could take a look at different statistics tracked by Statistics Canada and Transport Canada, kind of on the movement of goods by rails. And we kind of saw flat to maybe 1% growth. We'll have to see what happens towards the end of the year for that. But volumes appeared relatively stable. It was prices that fell significantly, and they fell significantly across all chemistry and resin sectors, and in some cases to lows not seen since the COVID pandemic. Now, part of that, as I mentioned kind of in the outlook, we were actually looking to see moderate price increases in 2025. We thought there'd be some positive development, I guess, in interest rate sensitive and cyclical sectors of the economy. Think things in the built environment. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these kind of in our outlook, but think about building construction, residential and commercial real estate. Think about auto sales, and then think about other durable goods too that are sold. Home appliances, sporting goods, those sorts of things. I think a lot of economic forecasts anticipated some of that last year. A strengthening in that and some of that last year, not just in North America, but across the world. And we did not see that happen. Now, of course, I think one of the key stories to how this unfolded was the incredible trade uncertainty that impacted Canada and the globe in early 2025. In Canada, that uncertainty peaked in the winter, but that is not the whole story of how the impacts of that unfolded. We had seen some evidence that even building up into 2025, that there were some perhaps stockpiling of different chemistry and resin products in anticipation of what was to come out of the White House. And that really took a while to unwind. The peak of uncertainty happened in February. Shortly after there, we saw the CUSMA tariff exemption for goods into the United States for Canada and Mexico. That was the peak of uncertainty, but of course, it takes a while for products that move as large are in as large volumes and are as critical to the manufacturing chain as industrial chemicals and resins. So the peak happened in the winter, but the effects sort of had long legs. And that's where, towards the end of 2025, I think we started to see volume stabilize quite well. We started to see prices start to stabilize in a lot of different chemistry sectors. But that also doesn't mean that those impacts have fully gone away. We do know there are some very important sectors here in Canada, autos and metals refining in particular, where they are still subject to tariffs, and there is a lot of chemistry in those products. So I think even within subsectors, Quebec was uniquely impacted last year in the chemistry space, whereas Ontario and Alberta had different diversification levels for their chemistry and resin sectors and were able to fare a bit better. So again, in 2025, we thought there'd be moderate increases. There were instead finding pricing lows that we had only really experienced during the full impacts of COVID. Volumes were stable, but those prices at a global level and at a regional level really fell. As we look into 2026, there are four key themes really that are kind of impacting the chemistry and plastic sectors. The first of those I kind of already touched on. It's these downstream sectors, which are sort of interest rate sensitive or considered discretionary spending. These may still face significant growth challenges. Last year, like I said, we came into that thinking we'd see some improvement. I'm quite a bit more cautious coming into it this year. The affordability challenges for consumers is very well known and quite widespread. And we're just not seeing the pickup in some of these other interest rate sectors that I think we normally would by this time in a rate cutting cycle. Key to this in particular is residential real estate, but also commercial real estate. You know, there's just not the same pickup in home building and apartment building that you'd like to see, even though certain regions in Canada saw kind of record levels for housing starts. Major declines in Ontario, in British Columbia. You're seeing similar things in the United States, kind of in the southern Sun Belt and in other areas. We're just not seeing home building reach those pre-COVID levels. Similarly with autos, and you know, in a North American context, we're still 10 to 12% lower than pre-COVID levels on annual auto sales. That's a very similar story across the world, especially in more mature markets like Europe and North Asia. We're just not seeing auto sales rebound the way they have. So a lot of these interest rate sensitive sectors, a lot of this cyclical sort of goods, and a lot of these durable appliances, a lot of things that people, you know, really stocked up on or had wholesale changeouts during the pandemic. Think your sporting goods. I don't plan to replace my Bowflex bike anytime soon. A lot of these sectors just aren't seeing the pickup in demand we would have expected. So I think we're coming into that with a much more, I think, cautious view. Another phrase you're going to hear a lot more of coming forward is overcapacity and its associated friend compressed production margins. You know, what we've seen, I think, over the last few years, it wasn't just really with the trade tensions hitting a peak last year, but really with the energy crises in Europe owing to the war in Ukraine, huge investments. Huge. And when I mean large, I mean, I think probably the biggest wave of chemistry investment the world has ever seen, starting production in China and building upon significant investments we saw here in North America and in the Middle East, owing to very, very favorable cost advantages with the shale revolution and low price natural gas. There's just a lot of chemistry capacity. There's a lot of product rationalizations that still have to occur, especially in these mature markets like Europe and North Asia in particular. The energy costs are just simply uncompetitive at these prices. Demand remains quite subdued. So we have a period of immense change occurring owing to these different factors. You will see capacity rationalizations in these mature markets. You will see new capacity come online in very competitive markets that either need the demand, such as growing markets in Asia, or those that are incredibly cost competitive here in North America, perhaps in some places in Latin America, think Brazil, for example, or in the Middle East. And it's going to take time to see these change. That also occurs, and that's going to continue to weigh, on chemistry prices, on production in some regions, and on investment decisions in the year to come. Trade policy uncertainty is still a very real factor in the chemistry world. Here for North America, especially with CUSMA, we're set to review the North American Free Trade Agreement. Depending on which country you're in, the acronym is different. But that review is going to pick up this summer, and it is critical to Canada's chemistry and plastic sectors that we maintain some aspects of that CUSMA agreement. Anywhere between 70 to 80% of overall industrial chemical demand is exported to the United States, and we import roughly a similar value. The US is a larger production center, but at a similar value from our partners there as well. We are deeply integrated into the North American supply chains. These supply chains have made North America competitive. So ourselves at CIAC, along with our colleagues in Washington and Mexico City, have come together for a second time to offer tripartite recommendations to strengthen the chemistry chapter in this CUSMA review. And this is something that until this review is completed, there is no question that it is going to provide some levels of uncertainty, not just in the chemistry and plastics sectors, but I think for all three economies, owing to how deeply we are integrated. And I've already kind of touched on it, the changing trade flows that are a result of some of these overcapacity and differing capacity issues. These will continue to play out, and tariffs will continue to impact how chemistry is traded around the world. North America isn't the only place with tariffs on chemistry. Tariff levels are quite high in many developing economies, such as India, Brazil, or in Pakistan, where tariff levels can be about 35% on chemistries and resins. We've also seen some countries decide to protect a few of their industries as well in this case, whether that be South Korea or a little bit more in Japan as well. We're starting to see countries realize how valuable chemistry is and how that production and how those trade flows end up, I think, balancing out is going to weigh on the sector. Finally, I think in 2025, while it had been a discussion really since the war in Ukraine had started, the nearshoring of manufacturing, building resilient supply chains, and I think governments across the world taking a harder look at their regulatory regimes and looking to make competitiveness more of a lens that everybody's viewing through means that competition for investment in this sector, in chemistry, and then in plastics production as well, is fierce. And I'm going to return to this a little bit later here to talk more about what we're seeing in Canada from different levels of government kind of on these files. But just to point out, as a key theme, a lot of countries are looking to get these types of investments, recognizing how important chemistry is to the broader economy inside their borders. And so that kind of brings us to the outlook for this year. So our forecast for chemistry in 2026, we expect shipment values to increase 2 to 3%, and this is really on the back of prices coming off these incredible lows into something a little bit more sustainable. Again, stabilization more than huge growth. You can kind of see here too that we expect volumes perhaps to grow to be roughly flat, maybe 1 to 2% growth in 2026. And that's for a few of the really impacted subsectors that saw a disproportionate impact in 2025, I think coming back and finding a bit more demand. With those prices stabilizing too, that should bring, again, a little bit more incremental supply to market, showing a little bit more stability. Exports should closely track the shipment values, so that 1 to 3%. And of course, this is assuming no new trade disruptions occur. Again, we are heavily integrated into the North American market, but that does not mean, we are impacted by other trade frictions. So again, think of the overcapacity, think of some of these other factors, and that's kind of where we're seeing it. For plastic product shipments, it's a little bit trickier. We expect to see 1 to 2% growth in 2026, and that's because a very large part of the plastic product value chain really closely tracks consumer spending. So forecasts for consumer spending growth in North America and in Canada, while subdued, kind of below the 2% real GDP growth, are still expected to be positive. When that's positive, we usually see plastic product demand also remain positive. Underpinning this forecast kind of broadly are three really, I think, key factors. One is North America's relative economic strength compared to other major markets. Canada, owing to really significant changes in, I think, our demographic and population growth, and with the trade certainty with the United States, is expected to be a little bit slower next year, kind of under our 2% potential in that 1.5% range. But the United States is expected to see, I think, a little bit stronger growth, somewhere in the 2.5 to 2%. 2.6% range. And then Mexico, and really it's a story of a lot of Latin America as well, is coming down off of quite high interest rate levels. So again, we're hoping to see some of that monetary policy lag for some of these cyclical sectors in Latin America kind of filter into the North American economy. The cost advantage that Canada, in particular, Western Canadian operations, but really it's a Canada story. The energy and feedstock cost advantage that we have should provide a strong starting point for operations. We saw last year, even as prices dropped significantly, the cost advantage of production here did provide a little bit of a tailwind for Canadian chemistry producers, in particular resins, which performed quite well in this backdrop. So that cost advantage operation, the relative, I think, weakness of both the Canadian and US dollars in relation to other global currencies in the last 12 months has also provided a bit of support for exports to other markets, not just to the United States. So a few things there with our cost advantages domestically, and then with foreign exchange working in our corner as well. And then again, while we're not predicting too much of a recovery here, positive impacts from improvement in cyclical demand and in business investment should provide further support. I don't think there's much expectation of this in the early half of 2026, but I think as we move through the CUSMA review period, I think as businesses kind of get used to the new normal, again, particularly in the United States, but also in Canada, as some of these things fade, you'll start to see the engines of growth pick up. Again, we're not predicting a lot here, but if these cyclical factors do start to gain some traction, it'll be in addition, and that's where you could see things bump into more positive growth territory, closer to two versus flat sort of expectations. So again, just kind of summarizing here for 2026, we're looking at very moderate growth, but stabilization in prices from very low levels. We're looking to see the volume of chemistries that are moving across Canada and across North America to be stable, if not growing a little bit more on the back of some of these downstream recoveries. And we expect plastic product shipments to really closely track consumer spending. Again, if we see more sales in the auto sector, if we see housing starts materially pick up or some of these durable goods, that will provide an extra shot, especially to plastics as well. There is an awful lot of plastic components that go into our built environment, and a lot of that is cyclical in nature. So I mentioned that I wanted to come back and have a kind of a deeper discussion about the competition for investment and new markets being as fierce as it is. You know, in 2025, I think one of the key things for Canada is we got ourselves a new federal government that has very ambitious goals to both strengthen Canada's domestic economy, strengthen our supply chains, and diversify Canada's trade options. And, you know, in CIAC with our member companies, we share those similar ambitions. We are an export-oriented sector, one that is growing its trade diversification while being deeply embedded in the North American economy. And I think to both those ends, we were pleasantly pleased by Budget 2025. In Budget 2025, released in November, we saw several investment attraction policies come due. We were quite excited to see a recommitment to accelerated capital cost accounting via the accelerated investment incentive, as well as the broader suite of super productivity credits. I love whoever came up with that phrase in finance, being able to find ways to lower the cost of capital. In the chemistry sector and increasingly in the plastic product sector, we are very capital intensive businesses. You invest for 40 years, not for 40 days, and the payback periods have to stretch across that. When you are outlaying that kind of capital, it really helps to have supportive policies in place that recognize this is where the largest risk points are. So accelerated capital cost accounting, allowing companies to deduct those expenditures as they're made. This is a really positive, transparent, and broad-based way to, I think, show manufacturers and show proponents that their investments will be here for the long run. We also saw some improvements to several of the investment tax credit programs that became law in 2024. We saw and we're very pleased to see the extension to the carbon capture utilization and storage tax credit, lengthening out the time horizon for it so it aligns more properly with capital investment cycles instead of political cycles. Especially as I mentioned, the downturn that we saw last year wasn't just unique to chemistry. It hit a lot of energy intensive and trade exposed sectors. We were pleased to see the government recognize that, by extending the time period of when that full capital cost was going to be, or when that full credit was going to be available for investors. Similarly, we also saw the clean hydrogen credit expanded with a new pathway for methane pyrolysis. We provided feedback to the government that that they not get too tied to singular pathways, to keep things technology and process agnostic, and we're happy to see the government kind of acknowledge that as well. And finally, the federal government has begun to fix its R&D incentive program. The Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Credit, known as SHRED, received a long overdue update in budget 2025. Just to kind of, I think, unpack this one a little bit more. Over the last really 22 years, the SHRED program has undergone a slow but steady narrowing and shrinking of its applicability. The types of activities that were allowed to be expensed had slowly been whittled down over time. The value that you were allowed to claim against expenses, again, slowly dropped over time. We estimate that by the beginning of 2025, that on a nominal and real value, SHRED had shrunk by about 75%, owing to different inflationary costs and how it was narrowed from where it was kind of before the financial crisis in the early 2000s, late 1990s. So what we saw here was a broadening of many of the things I just touched on. We saw a significant expansion of the amount of capital allowed to be expensed, an expansion of the activities that were, and a broadening of the types of companies that can now access it as well. Not just Canadian private companies, but Canadian publicly owned companies are able to do it. So this was a good step. But like everything, we cannot rest on our laurels with some of these things. More is needed, more is needed to recognize the value and the roles that chemistry and plastics play in manufacturing value chains. A lot of these broad-based commitments are excellent in that everybody is allowed to access them. There is no decisions made behind closed doors. But at the same time, we do have programs, particularly the ITCs, and with the SHRED program too, as examples, where we haven't seen the type of the broad-based coverage that you'd like. Let's look at critical minerals as an example. For the critical minerals tax credit, the clean manufacturing tax credit, a lot of the different processes in critical mineral development are covered. For processing and refining, those types of materials are completely covered. However, the chemistry you need to actually run those reactions, to separate ores from the slag, to move beyond rocks into useful materials, that chemistry is not part of it. We think these types of oversights, where you collect almost all of the product and capture it for with an investment incentive to not meet the roles of chemistry in it, we think that's part of an oversight. These are the types of discussions we're going to continue having, not just in critical minerals. This is going to be especially important in different types of electronics manufacturing, especially in semiconductor manufacturing. It's going to be critical as Canada looks to rebuild its defense and aerospace supply chains. There's a lot of chemistry that go into these products. Something we're going to do continuously through 2026 is show governments the unique roles that these chemistries plays and why it makes good sense to focus on reshoring and ensuring you have access to these here versus having to import them from elsewhere. Similarly, the government, provided that very ambitious target of doubling Canada's trade with other markets outside of the United States in the next 10 years. We support that goal wholeheartedly, but in order to meet new markets, to get your products to market, you need to have efficient and competitive transportation and trade networks. And over the last several years, let's say going back to even 2018, 2019, the level of disruptions that have hit critical transportation and trade infrastructure have only been increasing. 2025 and 2026 are sort of unique years where we're really in between negotiations between major, rail service providers, major port operators, and their respective unions. But we know that all of those labor agreements will come up for renewal. There will be collective bargaining to address that. But what we can't have are these continual disruptions where the collective bargaining process ends and either lockouts or strikes begin. We're very happy to see both houses of parliament right now, the Senate and the Parliamentary Committee on Trade and Transportation and Human Resource Networks are looking at how these processes are functioning. CIC and its member companies support collective bargaining where it is required, of course, but we want to keep companies bargaining. We don't want to see these failures, and we really don't want to see these failures shut down the economy. So ensuring that policymakers are aware that there is no plan B for the chemistry sector when rail transportation is closed, that the only option if our ports shut down to hit Tidewater is to go through the United States. We want to make sure that these discussions create a new framework that keeps the parties talking, achieves negotiated agreements between them, and keeps economies moving forward as these occur. And finally, Budget 2025 also recommitted to a review of industrial carbon pricing in Canada. Industrial carbon pricing is critical to chemistry sector competitiveness. CIAC and our member companies support industrial carbon pricing where it's in place, as long as competitiveness is maintained with our largest trade partners, with a global lens, and that we are constantly monitoring what happens with either production or emissions leakage when it comes to chemistry and plastics. Um, these products, the products that we produce, that the chemistry sector produces, will be needed in the future economy one way or another. Our goal is to make sure that we can produce those here, that we can reduce emissions here and grow production here versus importing it from other jurisdictions that don't have the same goals. As we go through this review, it's going to be very crucial that both the sector and policymakers are on the same page to make sure we're not seeing adverse impacts to climate from climate policy here on our members and on production. Okay, and that kind of brings me to a formal end to this webinar. I'd like to thank everybody for your time today. I hope I was able to provide a good overview of where we came from in 2025, what we're seeing as we enter 2026, and some of the really key issues that we're spending a lot of time on or that we have our eyes on as we go forward. I understand we have a little bit of time here for Q&A. I think we're going to get everybody. If you do have questions, please throw it into the chat versus having to unmute and all those sorts of things. But again, thank you for your time today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have with the time left for today.
Yeah, so if there's any questions, put it in the chat and I'll ask on your behalf.
I do have a couple of quick starters here. So I think I'm going to quickly take the one on trade. Where are growth markets for chemistry and plastics? And are they internal or are they external to Canada? I think the beauty of this question and of these answers is it's all of the above. Canada's chemistry sector and our resin sectors in particular are export oriented. So we are constantly keeping our eyes on markets that could need new products. We've seen diversification, particularly in resin products, over the last few years, growing trade with Asia in particular. But we've also started to see, I think, really since the energy crisis has started to hit in Europe, small pockets of growth, even into mature markets as well. And that really owes to our very competitive cost and production basis here in North America that we can access some of these. We do have relatively close trade routes in most cases to North Asia from the West Coast and to the Atlantic and to our European counterparts on the East. So I do think for these growth markets in more mature ones, there's quite a bit to do here. Internally, I already touched on it. The Canadian governments across the world, I think, are really starting to look closer at their supply chains, look closer at their critical downstream manufacturing industries, and saying, what do we need to have here? What could we have here? And our goal is to kind of make sure that they don't forget about chemistry and plastics in those. Again, I already mentioned critical minerals, defense, aerospace, and in particular, too, I think just largely the built environment is areas for growth here. We're also starting to see, because Canada is a very north-south trading country, we're actually starting to see some companies too start looking east and west. Now, that's owing to, I think, some of the trade uncertainty that was introduced last year. And Canada is not the largest market in this case for it. But I think seeing some of that demand, which just for years had been met with imported goods, could be met with Canadian as well. So again, strengthening internal supply chains, finding new markets to meet government goals, and then diversifying trade into both growing and mature markets. It's an all of the above answer here in 2026.
Dave, I have one question from the
For sure.
chat. Thanks, Tammy, for this. So, given the international nature of the industries, how closely do you monitor other countries and large companies' plans for expansion and growth?
I definitely keep an eye on it. We can only control what we can control in Canada when it comes to policy advocacy. But one thing, I've really enjoyed my time at CIC Learning is just like keeping an eye on what other jurisdictions are doing to entice investment there. We've picked up a lot of good ideas, not necessarily perfect ones, from jurisdictions as diverse as Germany, Louisiana, even some of those in the Gulf or in North Asia and Taiwan and China as ways to kind of, incent companies to invest here. One of the things that Canada has going for it is some of the most cost effective energy resources and feedstocks in the world. We are very competitive from a cost basis in that sense. As just mentioned, we also do have relatively good transportation links, although logistics do start to matter when you're crossing oceans. But there are a few really good starting points. And we see governments in Canada, I mentioned the federal government, but subnational governments, particularly Alberta, through the Petrochemicals Incentive Program, has long recognized the value of chemistry and resin investments. And we're starting to see more governments do that. Our goal here in 2026 is to get that even further, to show them that there's an even better case to invest here in Canada. Part of that is going to be a successful conclusion of the CUSMA review, and another is making sure our investment and regulatory policies are in line for when companies come looking, we're ready to put shovels in the ground in pretty quick order.
I got one more for you. This is anonymous, so thank you, anonymous. Will reducing internal trade barriers here in Canada have positive impacts on chemistry and plastics in Canada?
I think it definitely helps on the margin. There a lot of chemistry and plastics trade is conducted by rail. So, there's a lot of things that there aren't really official barriers to trade. I do think some of the stuff around trucking in particular can be quite helpful to some of our members who utilize either for delivery purposes or for raw materials. Being able to, not have to switch drivers for these types of things, especially in, quite close areas like where Quebec and, or sorry, where we are around Ottawa, so close on both borders. I think those things can definitely help. The bigger factor really on this was last fall, or sorry, last spring. That's when we saw from companies, owing to the trade tensions, owing to the trade uncertainty, starting to look at their own supply chains and go, hey, where am I getting this from? And is there potential for me to get it here in Canada? In some cases, that's no. In other cases, you know what? Canada produces quite a bit. It's just, I think people get comfortable over time. I've always bought my resin from distributor X and never really thought about it. Well, you know what? I think more companies are thinking about it. So I think the combination of both things, that trade uncertainty kind of forcing a rethink, and then a government making it a priority to have different Canadian jurisdictions working together, I think it's kind of there's some synergy there. So hopefully we can kind of see that. It's a little bit trickier to tease out with Statistics Canada data. We'll have to wait a bit, but I do think we're hearing a lot more companies have those conversations and looking internally for solutions versus overseas.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave. Got one more for you, and thanks for all the questions. How does CIAC assess the impact of Canada's renewed trade relationship with China on existing projected plastics overcapacity in North America, particularly given China's role as a major producer and exporter of polymer and plastic products?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes that I think came to light last year was the incredible investment boom that China has been undergoing. I kind of mentioned here in North America, it was really driven by the shale revolution. We saw once you were able to pull cost effectively from different shale formations, the cost of production. So before AI and electronics was the big focus, actually, chemical manufacturing was in about an 8-year boom in North America as well. So we were actually one of the most, I think, investment intensive sectors. And quietly, starting a little bit later in the mid 2010s, China made its own push. There are more than a few, I think, issues when it comes to trading with China. They do have at times quite high tariffs on different polymer products. That's something that we know our friends at Global Affairs have been working on over the years. We do know too that they have started a few anti-dumping investigations, not just against Canada, but against polymer producers everywhere. It's it's one where I think if you had free and fair trade both ways, the cost advantages of Canadian production of Canadian resins and chemistries would be exceptionally competitive. But it's a little bit different. We do have some companies that are quite successful selling into that market, and it's one that I think we have to constantly monitor the relationship and work on it. But I fully expect you're going to hear a lot more in 2026 and in 2027 about chemistry investments and chemistry production coming in China. It's going to be a global issue over the next few years.
Thanks, Dave. Looks like that's it for questions. I'll give it a final opportunity if anyone wants to chime in. And if not, we appreciate it, folks. We're going to record this, put it on YouTube. I'll send out the link to everyone tomorrow, and then we'll do a bit of a recap in Chem News. So just to promote Chem News, if you're not a subscriber, please do. That'll be out next week. So thanks for everyone for attending. We appreciate it. Have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to hear more.